Hi, I'm James Carter, and today I'm going to show you how to make a simple bezel. It's going to take about 5 minutes. It's a good project to learn with, to go with. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a piece of 28 gauge fine silver. I make my own bezel wire because I like thicker wire for bigger stones and thinner wire, and I like to be able to cut it so that the height is different for what I'm going to be using it for. Right now I'm just going to be making this for like a 14 by 10 cabochon. Any cabochons, it's the same technique no matter what the shape is, just follow along here. Okay, so I've got my piece of wire here. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my stone and I'm going to put the middle of the bezel, or the end of the bezel, right there at the middle of the stone, and I'm simply going to wrap it around with my fingers. I get it wrapped around, I look at it, I see that that's a pretty tight fit. I take a marker and I just scribe it. That's the last I need of the stone. I'm then going to take my joist chin scissors, which you really need to have a pair of, and I'm going to cut it right across the line, just like that. Now the joist chins are going to put a little bit of a spoon in the metal, which you don't want. So I'm just going to take a pair of flat nose pliers and I'm going to squeeze the two ends. So I want these two to meet each other and kiss. They don't have to be oval to be perfect. They can be any shape you want, as long as the two ends are meeting each other. That's the most important thing. I've been making and selling my jewelry for 43 years now. And I can tell you right now, the first thing that a customer sees when they're looking at your work, if you're using stones, is the bezel. If it's not done correctly, you're not going to make a sale. So I get these two guys to where they're looking good, and then I just simply squeeze it with my flat nose pliers so that my two pieces are perfectly flush when I run my finger over it, just like that. And I want them to be a little bit, try to get it straightened up so they're on the same. Now when I do this, when you saw me doing this, going back and forth, I'm putting tension in the back of the bezel so that when I pull it apart and let it go, they're going to want to push towards each other. The last thing you want to do is when you're soldering this bezel together is have it separate. So put a little tension in the back of it. It's really going to help you out. All right, that's really good. I put a little bit of flux right here just on the seam, a little bit on the inside, and I'm going to solder it on a charcoal block. I like soldering on charcoal. I just like the heat transfer. Now I'm going to be using hard solder on this. Just a little tiny piece. And I just heat it up a little bit and then kind of use that flux that acts as a glue and put it right there on the seam. As you see, I'm not concentrating my torch on the seam. I'm moving the torch back and forth to get the adjacent area of the bezel hot. You're not welding, you're not fusing. You're not going to take this torch and just zoom in right on the seam and expect it to fuse. You have to get the adjacent part hot, and that's what's going to make the solder happy and want to flow. So it just flowed. I'm going to quench this in a piece of water, a piece of water, and I'm going to look at it. All right, that went all the way. So now I'm going to take this little oval bezel mandrel that I have, and I'm just going to push it around here on my fingers. Look at it for fit, and I will test the stone. Good fit. And now I'll put it in the pickle. Okay, I've taken my bezel out of the pickle. It looks good, and I'm ready to solder it to the plate. But before I solder it to the plate, I want to go ahead and flat sand the bottom of it just a little bit, because it's very important. This little step right here is going to save you a lot of heartache. After I get it sanded, I'll take it and I'll put it on my plate and I'll look at it to make sure I do not see any daylight. If you have daylight, sand it a little bit more. Daylight means it's uneven, and if you try to put solder on there, it is not going to fill up that crevice that you make. Solder only is made to attach two pieces of metal. It's not a filler. So I look at this and I think, okay, I don't see any daylight. That looks really good. So now we're going to take my tripod and we're going to do this soldering on top of that. I'm putting my piece of plate on the tripod. I'll put a little bit of flux right on it, like that. A little flux on the bezel. Now remember, I soldered the bezel together with hard solder. I'm using medium now. So the reason I'm not soldering this on with a piece of charcoal is look at the difference here. You've got a really thin piece of bezel wire here, and you got a really big heavy piece of plate here. If you take that plate and lay it down on a charcoal block and put the bezel on top of it and try to solder it, what's going to happen? The bezel is going to get so hot so quick that it'll melt. This way you're going to put the torch underneath and the heat is going to go into the plate and the bezel is going to draw the heat up and make the solder flow. So like I said, we're going to do this with medium solder. I'm just going to take one or two pieces and drop them on the inside. I like my solder on bezels on the inside because it means there's no cleanup. So I've got two pieces in it. I'm going to use a little bit hotter flame this time because you have to realize that this piece, I'm going to turn my light out too. This piece of screen here is a heat sink. That means it's going to take up a lot of the heat before it gets to the silver. So you adjust your flame accordingly. All I'm going to do is just heat it and get it hot. And when I see it starting to boil, I'll pull it back so that that solder will not get so hot that it pops out. There she goes. And the capillary action will make it go right over to the side of the bezel. So, important. When you're watching this, I'm not concentrating my heat dead center. I'm bringing my heat around. I want the entire plate to get hot so that when that bezel is happy, it's going to say, I'm ready to go home. And it's going to flow directly to the plate really quick. It's getting ready to go right now. So I'm just going all the way around, and there she goes. I see that nice little bit of sparkle there. Sometimes I'll just take it and hit it on top just to make sure it goes all the way through, but that's it. I'm going to take my piece now and throw it in the pickle, and then we'll come back. Okay, so this is my bezel. Looks good. It's got a little bit of markings on it. We're not worried about that. Before I forget, I want to let you know that the sheet that I'm using is 24 gauge sterling silver. The bezel is fine silver. I never use the fine silver for anything but bezels. That's what it's good for. So now I'm going to cut this out. I'm going to get my handy dandy saw here. When you buy a saw, do not buy a saw that says German style. You want to get one that says made in Germany. Try to keep the rust off of it, but I have so many of these laying around they just get dirty. Now, sawing. You need to learn how to saw, but we'll take that up in another one. What I do is I start right here, and as you can see, my saw is straight up and down, and I'm holding it with a very light touch. I start with an upstroke. That sets the blade. This is a 5/0 blade, a laser gold. I'm cutting this as close to the bezel as I can without cutting into the bezel itself. Good reason for that. I don't like I said before, I don't like cleanup. I try to keep the saw straight up and ahead of me. I don't take this thing and move it all the way around over here to try to get around a curve. I just stop and move it so that it's always right there at 6 o'clock. I like to cut between 8 o'clock and 4 o'clock. This is at 6. So I'll take this thing and go around here till about 8 o'clock, and then I'll stop and I'll just move the whole thing. Put your fingers firmly on it, and that's another reason why I use a big piece of sheet on the bottom. I like something to put my fingers on. Don't try to scrimp on metal and only cut a piece big enough for the bezel. So there we are. There's our bezel. I usually cut them a little bit tighter than that, but this will work. Now I take a file. This is just a number 3 cut flat file, and I use this to go over the entire thing. I'm hitting the bezel and the plate. Don't do this with a Fordham. You're just going to put grooves in it. Use a file. Learn to use your files. They're your best friends. And don't try to just get the plate itself. Get the whole thing, the bezel and the plate. It makes it smooth and it makes it uniform. So I'm soldering over my solder joint. Now, the reason I use hard solder on the bezel, when you're soldering a bezel, you don't want the solder to flow out of the joint and follow the medium right around the bottom, because you'll have a nice little gap there and you can't get rid of it. So always do your bezels in hard so that doesn't happen. And remember, hard solder is the closest to color of silver. So as the piece starts to tarnish or wear or get old, you're not going to see that seam. And nothing flows better than hard solder. Okay, there she is. She's all filed up. I'm going to go ahead and touch the back a little bit, not too much. Throw a little sand on it. So that's my bezel so far. Now, I'm going to clean this up real quick, and I'm going to show you the 2 tools that I use for cleanup. I don't use a wheel anymore. I strictly use a couple of these and some 4/0 steel wool. I start with this little gizmo. This is a Kratex wheel. And I take the Kratex wheel, I put it in my Fordham, and I take a heatless Mizzy. That's this little gizmo right here. And the Kratex wheel, it comes flat. I shape it. I shape it until I put a nice 45-degree on it. It lets me hold it a lot nicer, and I can really get that shape. When you're holding your Fordham, remember, you hold your Fordham with 4 fingers and let your thumb act as a fulcrum to help hold this piece. So I'm going to take this. This is a fine Kratex wheel. They're available at Rio Grande, $75 for 100, and you will go through 100 of them if you make as many bezels as I do. When I'm making bezels, not as much now, but when I used to do the shows, I'd lay out 100 of them, 100 stones, and make the bezels for them, and I could usually have them done by happy hour, time to go get a beer. But I've done a lot of bezels. Okay, so all I'm doing is smoothing it out with the Kratex wheel. Then I go around and I hit the top of the bezel, just a tiny bit, not much, just to get any kind of burrs off of it. Leave that there. I take the Kratex wheel out, and I'm going to switch over to a boar bristle brush. Soft. They come in different grits. This is soft. And bobbing compound. Now, what this does more than anything else, this gets rid of fire scale. Fire scale, I'm going to show you what fire scale is right here. There's a perfect example of fire scale. That little gray tint is the copper that's coming to the surface. This stuff eats it alive and gets rid of it really quick. Now remember, there's no fire scale on your fine silver, only the sterling. So I'm going to hit this real quickly. And then I'm going to use the same wheel just to go around my bezel and clean her up. Takes all the scratches out. I clean the inside up. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this over to my sink with a little bit of ammonia and some soapy water, and I'm going to clean it up and then come back. So this is my bezel, cleaned up, ready to go. No fire scale. Like I said before, this is just a very simple bezel. There's tons you can do with it. You can add a double bezel, you can cut the center out, you can make it higher. I do another tutorial where you're setting boulder opals where you have unlevel tops, and I'll show you how to contour the bezel for that. But for right now, this is just a very quick bezel that you should really learn how to make, because it'll make a difference in how your work is looked at, and I guarantee it'll increase your sales. This is another option. This is one I did earlier. It's the same thing, same bezel, only this time I left myself a margin, and I just cut it out with a little bit of an edge on the outside, and then I was able to take a file and file a little notch in it and take a piece of tubing and solder a piece of tubing in instead of a jump ring, so that I would have something to hang a bail on. So there it is, and we will see you again.